What's up, North Shore Youth? How we doing? We good? We good? You good? All right, all right. Well, welcome back. Man, I love the fact that you guys are here. Thank you for coming and being a part of this. I will say tonight, I am feeling a little bit under the weather. I very rarely get headaches, and when I do, they just kind of kick my butt. So I've been battling a headache all day, and so I would just ask for your help tonight as I prepare to give you the message, as I'm speaking. Please don't be a distraction. I don't want to have to fight with you guys tonight because I just don't have the energy to do so. So please lean in, yes. Please listen. If you missed last week, we're doing this new thing. If I say listen, you got to put a finger in the air. You got to say listen. Listen. So listen. As we go through this, take notes. You got some notes on your chair, so go ahead and grab those and get ready to jot some stuff down because we are continuing in our series that we started last week called Brave. How many of you were here last week? Man, I really enjoyed last week's message. Honestly, last week and this week, I felt like I was basically preaching to myself. Last week, we talked a lot about anxiety. Paul writes a letter to the Philippian church and says, be anxious for nothing. And that's a little bit difficult, yes? How are you guys doing with that? Be anxious for nothing. Anybody deal with some anxiety sometimes? A few people? Yeah, and I do for sure. And so last week's message and this week's message, man, I feel like these maybe were written specifically to me. Maybe you guys will get something out of it as well. I'm just believing that God has a word to speak to our hearts today. And so last week, we started off by talking about how we all want to be brave, right? Yes? Can you guys see me if I'm sitting down? Is this okay? I'm just tired. My head hurts, so I'm going to sit. Is that cool? All right. Cool. How many of you want to be brave? Anybody want to be brave? Maybe you don't consider yourself brave, but you want to be. The thing is we all want to be brave, right? We all want to believe that we have this bravery inside of us, that there's this sleeping lion inside of us just waiting to be woken up. And the thing is oftentimes we're unable to awaken that bravery on our own. But because we belong to Jesus, come on, because we're God's kids, we don't have to live life intimidated by big problems and bad reports and bleak circumstances. We just don't. Because we're God's kids, the Bible tells us that we have not been given a spirit of fear. Rather, we have been given a spirit of power, of love, and of a sound mind. And last week we talked about a story in Mark chapter 4 where the disciples and Jesus, they're going across the Sea of Galilee. And this massive storm hits them, and while the storm is raging, Jesus is sleeping inside the stern of the boat, and the disciples are freaking out, and they're running down there, and they're yelling at Jesus, Jesus, don't you care? Don't you know that we're going to die? Jesus, wake up, do something about this. And Jesus stands up, and with 3 words, peace, be still. The wind, the waves, the storm has to completely stop and be obedient to Jesus. And in the same way that there was bravery sleeping in the stern of that boat, come on, there's bravery sleeping inside of all of us. And we can awaken that bravery. We can be brave if we will lean into Jesus and trust the power of the Holy Spirit. Come on. Yes? Yes? So tonight we're going to be continuing our Brave series. This is almost a part 2 of last week. And so I'm going to reference last week a whole lot this week. It's just kind of a second part of that message. And so if you're taking notes, the title of my message tonight is Think Again. Somebody say think again. Think again. How many of you guys ever wake up late for school? Anybody? Somebody said this morning. Isn't it the worst, right? When you wake up late for school and you have to like scramble to get dressed and get ready, and it's like you look at yourself in the mirror, it's like I definitely need to shower. Anybody, right? It's the worst. I remember one time when I was in high school, I went to Adams Central, and I had to let's go AC. Anyways, so I remember I had to leave my house at 7:15 to get to school on time. And so I remember waking up one morning and looking at my alarm clock, and my alarm clock said 8 a.m. And I was so frustrated. Like, I'm trying to, like, wipe the sleep out of my eyes to make sure that it actually says 8 a.m. And I jump out of bed as fast as I could, and I run into the bathroom, and, like, I take one look at myself in the mirror and realize, like, I can't go to school looking like this. I have to shower. And so I took the fastest shower I've ever taken in my entire life. And as I'm getting out of the shower, I just about died because my feet were still wet and my floor was slippery, and I just about ate it as I'm on my way out of the shower. And I run back to my bedroom, and I put on all my clothes, and I'm sitting down on my bed to put on shoes, and I look at my clock again. And guess what time it said? 3:12. Oh, I was so mad. You have no idea. I was so mad. I'm sitting there on my bed, and again, I'm like rubbing my eyes like, did I time travel? Like, what in the world happened? Did I slip into a wormhole when I slipped out of my shower? Like, what's going on? And so I'm looking at my clock, and I realized what had happened is when I sat up in bed thinking it was 8 a.m., it was really 3 a.m., but I just thought it was something else. You know what I'm talking about? And I was so frustrated. And so I get undressed again, and I'm laying in bed, and I'm trying to go back to sleep. But I'm just laying there, and I'm thinking through everything that's just happened, and I'm just frustrated. I was so mad. I was so frustrated. Like, I couldn't shut my mind off. And so I was just laying there. Plus the fact that I had just taken a shower. And so, like, I was fully awake at that moment. You know what I'm talking about? And there was no going back to sleep. So I ended up staying up until my alarm went off at 7:15 or whatever time it goes off to help me get out of bed and get to school on time and all that stuff. But that was a bad day. I'll just be honest with you. That was a real bad day. That ever happened to you? Anybody? Maybe not that specifically, but something along those lines where you think one thing and then come to find out you were completely wrong. Anybody? Right? It doesn't necessarily have to be with your alarm clock. I know most of us don't have alarm clocks anymore. This was back in the day before smartphones existed. But our thought life is really important. Listen. Our thought life is really important. Hear me? Our thought life, Paul knew that our thought life was important. Last week we talked about Philippians 4, 6, and 7. We talked about the peace that surpasses all understanding when Paul says, be anxious for nothing. We don't have to be anxious for anything. And so Paul actually wrote that letter to the Philippian church while he was in prison. And it's really easy to be anxious when you're behind bars and surrounded by guards. You know what I'm talking about? Right? And so Paul, as he's writing this letter to the Philippian church, he understood that your thought life mattered. What you think about matters. What you meditate on matters. And so I want to look at a couple of passages tonight that focus on our thoughts. Again, last week we looked at Philippians 4, 6, and 7. Tonight we're just going to continue with what Paul was talking about, and we're going to look at verses 8 and 9. Paul says this. He says, and now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Somebody say final. One final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Keep putting them into practice, all that you've learned and all that you received from me, everything that you've heard from me and saw me doing. Then the God of peace will be with you. Basically what Paul is saying here is if you're not thinking about these things, think again. Yeah? If you're not thinking about what is good and what is admirable and what is honorable and what is worthy of praise and what is pure and what is lovely, if you're not thinking about these kinds of things, you need to think again because your thought life is way more important than you ever thought possible. And it's interesting that Paul uses the word final. He says one final thing. Somebody say final. He says one final thing. He's going to go on to talk about more in this letter, but he kind of sums his letter up with this sentence. He says, one final thing. Think about this stuff, and the God of peace will be with you. Essentially what Paul is saying here is that where our bravery ends, God begins. Yes? Where our bravery ends, God begins. Where we're not strong enough, where we fail, God excels. Yes? God is bigger. Yes? God is stronger, yes? That where our bravery ends, where we fail to be brave, that's where God begins. And that's where God begins to move. And the God of peace will be with you. Last week, Paul referenced the peace of God. Now he's talking about the God of peace. And we could probably end this series on one single thought, and it's this. We can be brave because we don't just have the peace that God gives, but we have the God who gives peace. Yeah? We can be brave because we don't just have the peace that God gives, we have the God who gives peace. We could probably end this entire series with that one sentence alone. I've done a lot more studying, so we're not going to end it right there. But if you're going to sum up this entire series in one message or in one sentence, that's it. We can be brave because we don't just have the peace that God gives. We have the God who gives peace. And so Paul is telling us, think about these kind of things. Think about what's pure. Think about what's lovely. Think about what's honorable. Think about what's admirable. Think about what's praiseworthy. Last week we talked about some things. Somebody say things. Last week Paul said, be anxious for no thing, right? Be anxious for no thing. What kind of things occupy our thoughts? Are they honorable? Are they right? Are they pure? Are they lovely? Or are they selfish? Are they pointless in the scheme of eternity? Are they lustful? Are they worrisome? Are they angry? Are they sad? What kind of things occupy our thought lives? We need to understand we can't live a courageous life. Courageous is another word for brave. Come on, nailed it. We can't live a courageous life without a concentrated mind. We can't live a courageous life. We can't be brave without concentrating and focusing on what God has called us to focus on. And so let me just ask you, what are you concentrating on? In your daily life, what do you concentrate on? What fills your thought life? What fills your mind? I've got a Fire Bible up here. My tablet just works better because I can see it a little bit easier because I'm getting old. But I've got a Fire Bible. It's a student edition Fire Bible. It's NIV translation. I would encourage you, if you don't have a Bible, this is the one you should get. It's on Amazon for like $40 right now. It'll be here in 2 days if you have Prime. Well, probably more like 7 because Prime is pretty sus now. But at in the bottom of the scripture, so it gives you the passages that the Bible is talking about, and then below that, it basically gives you in layman's terms what that means. Does that make sense? So kind of like how we, on Wednesday nights, we unpack what the Bible is saying. That's what it does for you. It unpacks what that means and what it's saying in layman's terms. And so the commentary in my Fire Bible in regards to these verses that we're looking at tonight, it says this. It says, the consequence of letting our minds be occupied with ungodly things is that we lose the peace of God and our hearts are no longer guarded. The consequence of letting our minds be occupied with ungodly things is that we lose the peace of God and our hearts are no longer guarded. It goes on to say that whatever occupies your thoughts will eventually work its way into your words and into your actions. Does that make sense? Very plain. Whatever you think about, you're going to end up doing. Whatever you meditate on, whatever you focus on, those things are going to work their way into your words and into your actions. And so whatever you think is going to begin to affect who you are and how you live. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Does that make sense? Well, the things that we think about, that's going to become who we are. That's going to become how we live. And last week we talked about how anxiety robs us of peace, and we also need to understand that an unfocused mind is going to ruin our faith. If we're not focused on the things that God has us to be focused on, we're going to have a faith that is really, really shaky. And so what we focus on, what we meditate on, what we marinate in, right? Remember that word from last week, miramnate? That's the word that Paul uses for anxiety in the Greek. He says, miramnate, be anxious for nothing, miramnate, meditate on. What are you marinating in? Whatever you marinate in, eventually you're going to be full of, right? Does that make sense? What I marinate chicken in at my house, eventually that chicken is going to take on the essence and the flavor of what I marinated it in. And the same thing happens in our thought life. Whatever we marinate in, whatever we meditate on, those are the things that are going to come out in our lives. We're going to take on the essence and the flavors of those things. And so we have to understand that faith is a byproduct of a correct focus. Faith is just a byproduct of a correct focus. When we're thinking about the things that God has called us to think about, when we're living the way that God has called us to live, when we're focusing on what God has called us to focus on, our faith grows. And it's just a byproduct of that. And so Paul he's challenging us to think again. Somebody say think again. He's saying think again. Focus on the right things. And not just once in a while. This isn't like focus on the right things once a week. Focus on the right things when you're at church. Focus on the right things when you're around your Christian friends. That's not what Paul is saying. In Philippians 4:9, we've already read this, but he says this, keep putting into practice all that you've learned from me. Keep putting into practice, and then the God of peace will be with you. Continue to do these things. Make it a habit. Do it regularly, not rarely. Come on. Think again, and then think again. And then think again. Our thought life matters. Hear me? What you think about matters. What you focus on matters. And the Philippian church wasn't the only church that Paul wrote a letter to about their thought life. There's another church in the city of Corinth that Paul wrote a letter to. There's a church there in that city, and he wrote a letter in 2 Corinthians 10:5. Paul says this. He says, we destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. And we capture, somebody say capture. Other translations say we take captive their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. Taking captive rebellious thoughts. What is a rebellious thought? It's anything that contradicts what God has already said. Yeah? That makes sense? Yes? A rebellious thought is it's anything that contradicts what God has already said. If God is saying that you are one thing according to Scripture and you begin to feel or think something else, then you got to take captive that thought because it's rebelling against what God has spoken over you. We have to learn to stand up to ourselves sometimes. Yeah? Sometimes we got to learn to tell ourselves to shut up. Sometimes we got to learn to tell ourselves to knock it off. Sometimes we got to learn to tell ourselves to be quiet and stop thinking about those things because it's not true. And so if you're here and you have thoughts of insecurity and shame and past failures and regret and worry, and you feel like you're never going to live up to the standard that you've set for yourself or that somebody else has placed on you, then this is a verse that you should memorize. That challenge to take captive those rebellious thoughts. Take captive the thoughts that cause you to think contrary to what God has already said. In fact, if you memorize this verse and you come to me next week and you give me this verse from your mouth, I'll get you something free from the snack shack. Cool? Cool? Yeah? So memorize that verse. 2 Corinthians 10:5. And come back next week, and if you recite that verse to me, I will get you something free from the snack shack. Because what Paul is saying here is that we have to put this to work in our lives. We have to work on taking captive the thoughts that threaten to destroy us. And if we will do that, if we'll be intentional about that, we're going to be able to destroy the opponents that have been defeating us our entire lives. Those anxious thoughts, those worrisome thoughts, those lustful thoughts, those thoughts that you're never going to be good enough, those thoughts that tell you you're not pretty enough, those thoughts that tell you you don't have enough friends. And if we'll get good at taking captive those thoughts, we're going to be able to shift our focus, and we're going to experience the peace of God. Yes? How many of you have things that you struggle with? Anybody? Struggle with some stuff? Maybe it's thoughts, maybe it's actions, maybe it's family, right? If I were to ask you what it is specifically that's holding you back from being the young woman or young man of God that you are called to be, you would probably start listing off some things. Yeah? Yes? You'd probably start listing off some things, maybe people or life events or family situations or family deaths or regrets or temptations or past failures or struggles. You'd probably list off some things. But listen, it's not the things that are holding you back. It's not the thing that's holding you back. It's how you think about the thing. It's how you focus on the thing. Yes, we all have things, right? Can we agree on that? We've all got some stuff going on in our lives. We all have stuff that's hard to deal with, that's hard to think through, that we struggle with, yes? But it's not the thing that's holding us back. It's how we think about the thing. If we will think about the right things and take captive the wrong things, then we'll begin to beat fear and awaken faith. So we have to learn how to hold on to the right thoughts and how to take captive the wrong thoughts. Do you know there's a difference between holding hands with somebody and being handcuffed to somebody? Think about that. There's a difference between holding hands with somebody and being handcuffed to somebody. Yes? Does that make sense? Holding hands with somebody is a choice, right? Unless they grab your hand first. But holding hands with somebody is a choice. But being handcuffed to somebody means that you're a prisoner, right? Does that make sense? Some of you guys are holding hands with the person next to you now. I see you boys. When you're handcuffed to somebody, it means that you are a prisoner. Listen, I hold hands with my wife because she's true and because she's noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable. But I'm not trying to hold hands with somebody who's trying to rob me of my things, who's trying to rob me of my peace, who's trying to rob me of my mental and physical well-being, right? Does that make sense? And so we have to learn to take hold of what is right and take captive what is wrong. Does that make sense? We take hold of what is right. We hold hands with what is right, and we take captive what is wrong. How many of you have ever been just really mad? Anybody? Maybe really mad at your sibling. I know Carson and Richard get really mad at each other all the time, and they like shove each other into the ground. Right? Sometimes we just get mad. When you get mad, has anybody ever told you, man, just let it go? Does that help? No, it doesn't. Because thoughts are like boomerangs. We let it go and they come back around. You know what I'm talking about? Right? It's like you're just super mad about something. Somebody's just like, just let it go. It's like, oh, great, thanks. Awesome. That's really good advice. Thank you for that. Those thoughts always come back around. And so there's a difference between taking a thought captive and letting a thought go. You know what I'm talking about? Like if you're laying in bed and you see a spider crawling on your bed, you're just not going to let that sucker go, right? Because he's going to probably crawl underneath the cool side of the pillow, and he's going to lay some eggs, and he's going to multiply, and then you're going to have to leave the house. You're probably going to have to burn the house down. You know what I'm talking about? Like that's how it goes. You don't just let that guy go. You capture that joker, and you flush him. Come on, right? Or at least you call mom and dad to come and dispatch the 8-legged demon. You know what I'm talking about? Right? Like there's a difference between letting it go and taking it captive. When we just let thoughts go, listen. When we just let things go, they're going to come back around, and they're going to multiply, and they're going to be worse when they come back around. Hear me? That's what's going to happen. And so we can't just let things go. We got to take them captive. We can't let lustful thoughts go because they're going to come back and they're going to be worse. We got to take them captive. We can't let angry thoughts go because they're going to come back around and they're going to be worse. We got to take them captive. Does this make sense? Paul is saying instead of letting it go, take it captive and put a high bail on it. Don't let that thing out without a fight. Come on. My wife and I, we watch a lot of shows together. Right now we're watching season 2 of Outer Banks. We're a little bit late on that one. But we love to watch TV shows together. One of our favorite shows that we've ever watched together was The Blacklist. Anybody watch The Blacklist? Oh, man. That show is so stinking good. It's basically about this, like, CIA or FBI, like, this like, covert section of that. And the main character is he's a bad guy himself. Like he's like a mastermind of evil, essentially. And he's got this black book full of names of other people that are basically working in the underground and working in all these bad areas of the world. And so they've taken him captive, and now they're using him to take captive all of these other bad guys. Does that make sense? I know I'm explaining it really poorly. I haven't seen it in a little while. But we love this show because every single show, every single episode, they grab these bad guys. They take these bad guys captive. And as they have them, they don't just let them go, right? Usually the bad guy ends up dead, spoiler. They don't just let him go, but they take him captive. And what do you do when you take a prisoner captive? They go to jail. What did you say, Ben? Death penalty, torture. Oh my God. You interrogate. Thank you, Charity. Man, you guys were taking some hard left turns on that. You torture them. Oh man, we're getting off the rails here. Listen. When you capture a bad guy, you interrogate the bad guy. Yes? Right? That's how it goes. You interrogate them. You figure out what they know. You figure out what they were doing. You figure out what the plan was. You figure out who their accomplices were. You interrogate them. And so listen, we need to learn to interrogate our imagination. Yes? We have to learn to interrogate our imagination. We need to start asking our thoughts some questions. One of which is, where did you come from? Where did that thought come from? Listen, you don't seem like the description that Paul has in Philippians 4. This doesn't sound like the description of what it means to have the peace of God that Paul describes in Philippians 4. And so thought, where did you come from? We got to learn to trace our thoughts back to the source. If it's a lustful thought, how did that get into our mind? Find the source of that. Figure out where that lustful thought came from. Figure out if it was a TV show or if it was a conversation that you had with somebody of the opposite gender or if it was something that you were watching on TikTok. Where did that thought come from? And don't go down that path anymore. Where did you come from? We got to learn to interrogate our imagination, yes? Yes? The second question we need to ask is, where is this thought going? Where is this thought threatening to take me because I'm not going there? Right? I'm not heading in that direction. We cannot live a courageous life without a concentrated mind, and so we have to take captive the thoughts that are threatening to steal our concentration. We have to take these thoughts captive. But how do we do that? We have to recognize that the God who makes us brave is the God who gives us the badge. Come on. Yes? The God who makes us brave is the same God who gives us the badge, who gives us the authority to take captive those thoughts in our lives, who gives us the authority to stop those things dead in their tracks, interrogate our imagination, say, where are you coming from and where are you going? I'm not going that way, and so I'm shutting you down. The God who makes us brave is the God who gives us the badge. I'm not big enough to demolish my thoughts. And I'm not strong enough to take every single thought that I have captive. But the badge that I carry comes with the authority given from the one who is big enough and who is strong enough. Hear me? And so we have to put that badge to work. That's what Paul tells us. Philippians 4:9, he says, put it into practice. Put it into practice. Work it. Read it. Walk it out. Meditate on it. Memorize it. Marinate in it. Live it. Put it into practice. Think about such things. Come on. And so if you're here tonight and your thoughts are full of fear, your thoughts are full of anxiety and insecurity and inadequacy and regret and shame, think again. Hear me? It's very simple. It's almost too simple. It's probably way easier said than done, and I get that. There's a lot of talk nowadays about intrusive thoughts. Have you heard people talk about that? Intrusive thoughts. There's a lot of talk about that, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with everything that has to do with intrusive thoughts, but I think the foundation of it is pretty cool. We all have intrusive thoughts, right? We all have those thoughts that pop into our head that we're like, man, I have no idea where that thought came from. I don't want to think about that. You know what I'm talking about? Things that are evil, things that are angry, things that are lustful. We've all got these thoughts that come into our minds sometimes, and some of it is a byproduct of the things that we watch. A lot of it is a byproduct of the things that we watch, and a lot of it is a byproduct of the things that we take in on a regular basis. But there's something that happens even when intrusive thoughts come, when we're intentional about taking that thought captive. When we stop in our tracks, and honestly, this is something that I do, and I probably sound like a crazy person, but I talk to myself. I do. When I've got thoughts that are creeping up in my head that I don't want to be there, I talk to myself. Out loud, I say, no, Dylan, stop thinking that thought. I talk to myself because I have to. If I don't take it captive, it's going to run rampant in my mind. It's going to multiply. It's going to come back. It's going to be worse. And so we have to take these thoughts captive. We have to learn to think again. We have to learn to think about the things that God says about us, to meditate on what is pure and what is right and what is honorable and what is lovely. And we have to remember that we don't just have the God of peace. Or we don't just have the peace that God gives, but we have the God of peace. He's with us. He's right there. He wants to walk alongside you. He wants to move in your life. He wants to help you grow. He wants to help you be the person that He's calling you to be. And so He wants to help you with your thoughts. Hear me? Yes? And maybe you're here tonight and you don't really have a relationship with Jesus. Maybe you come to church and maybe you have friends that are Christians, but you're not really right with the Lord. I want to give you the opportunity to begin a relationship with Jesus. Maybe your whole life you've been held captive by the thought that God can't love you because of what you've done, or because of what your family did, or because of what your family says about you. Maybe you're so full of regret and shame that you think Jesus doesn't love you. You've been stuck in some of those thoughts. Listen, the Bible tells us that if we'll just confess with our mouth and believe in our heart that Jesus is Lord and that God raised Him from the dead, that we'll be saved. And in all honesty, you don't get the God of peace without submitting yourself to Him. You don't get the peace that God gives without giving your life to the God of peace. Hear me? And so I'm going to ask everybody to bow their heads and close their eyes. And we're going to get into our small groups in just a minute. But I want to take just a moment. If you're here tonight and you don't have a relationship with Jesus, maybe your thought life has been plagued with that idea that God can't love you because of what you've done. You need to understand that Jesus gave His life for you, and He would do it again. And so if you're here tonight and you don't have a relationship with Jesus, but you want to start one, I'm just going to ask you, with every head bowed, every eye closed, would you just raise your hand? I see those hands. Thank you. That's awesome. That's awesome. Is there anybody else? Awesome. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pray a prayer, and I'm going to ask you to repeat this prayer after me. And I want you to understand that there's nothing magical about the words that I'm about to say. But again, if you believe in your heart and you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, the Bible says that you will be saved. And so I'm going to ask everybody to pray this prayer with me so that you don't feel alone. Jesus, thank you for loving me, for choosing me, for walking alongside me. Jesus, right now, I choose you. I love you. Help me, God, to be the person you're calling me to be. Forgive me for what I've done, and help me to turn away from who I used to be and follow you. Jesus, I love you, and I thank you, and I want to spend my life going after you. In your name, amen. Amen.